Ringo Starr spent a lifetime smiling for the world. But behind that smile lived a man shaped by wounds he never fully confessed. For decades, he carried private bitterness toward someone who once stood close enough to be family, someone whose choices carved a scar deeper than any insult from the press. The man known for peace, humor, and calm finally admitted that one name haunted him more than all the others. And when you hear who it is, the story behind it will make you see Ringo in a completely different light. The insecurity that followed him into the Beatles. Ringo Starr was born Richard Starkey in wartime Liverpool, a child whose life began with sickness rather than music. At 6, peritonitis nearly killed him and forced him out of school for more than a year. At 13, tuberculosis locked him inside a sanatorium for 2 long years, leaving him quiet, withdrawn, and far behind other children academically. Those lost years shaped the insecurity that would follow him into adulthood, the sense that everyone else was smarter, stronger, more skilled. What saved him was a small drum given by the nurses, a distraction that evolved into a dream and eventually a lifeline. By the early 1960s, the Beatles had raw energy but lacked the rhythmic foundation that could lift their music beyond the pubs of Liverpool. Ringo, meanwhile, was steady, reliable, and already respected in Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. When the Beatles' producer at EMI expressed dissatisfaction with Pete Best, the decision was inevitable. On August 16, 1962, Ringo Starr became the final piece of the Beatles. Fans embraced him instantly, but the industry did not. Headlines mocked him as the luckiest drummer alive. Critics joked he could only keep time, and the press labeled him the least talented Beatle before he even had a chance to prove otherwise. What made it worse was how painfully aware Ringo was of the hierarchy inside the band. John Lennon and Paul McCartney towered as the songwriting gods. George Harrison was the frustrated genius fighting for space. And Ringo, the new guy, the replacement, the drummer with a thin resume, often felt like he was there to smile, steady the beat, sing a novelty tune, and stay out of the way. Even the moment that should have been his triumph, playing on Love Me Do, turned humiliating when producer George Martin brought in session drummer Andy White because he didn't trust Ringo yet. Years later, Ringo admitted the sting lingered. I made him apologize every day. The message was clear from the start. He was needed, but he was not respected. And this insecurity became the seed that later made the deepest betrayal hurt far more than it should have. The slow burn of George Harrison's silence. Among all the people who wounded Ringo Starr, the pain caused by George Harrison was the most unexpected. George wasn't loud, cruel, or confrontational. He didn't mock Ringo in public or belittle him in the studio. Instead, his wound came in the form of distance, quiet, cutting distance that grew year after year, until the friendship Ringo trusted most felt like an empty echo. In the early Beatles years, Ringo relied on George more than anyone else. George understood what it felt like to be overshadowed by John and Paul. He understood what it meant to fight for space, for respect, for recognition. That bond made George the closest thing Ringo had to a true confidant inside the band. But as the late 1960s unfolded, cracks began to appear. George increasingly turned to outside collaborators, Eric Clapton, Billy Preston, Bob Dylan, the musicians who would later form the core of the Concert for Bangladesh in 1971. Ringo watched silently as George built brilliant, emotionally layered music with everyone except him. The pain wasn't jealousy. It was the sense of being forgotten by someone he had always stood beside. The worst moment came in 1968, during the recording of While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Instead of relying on his own bandmate, George invited Clapton to record the iconic guitar part. It wasn't merely a creative choice. It was a message Ringo felt deep in his chest. Even inside the Beatles, everyone was replaceable. Years later, Ringo bitterly whispered to a friend, Turns out I'm not the only one in the band who could be left behind. After the Beatles broke up in 1970, the distance became even more painful. George poured himself into new albums, new collaborators, new worlds. Ringo, struggling to cement his own place as a solo artist, felt their bond slipping with every passing month. In one reunion, he half-jokingly told George, "You've got the whole world to work with, except me." George only smiled politely, offering no explanation. That silence, more than any argument or insult, wounded Ringo in a way he never spoke openly about. With John and Paul, the fights were loud and obvious. But with George, the betrayal was quiet, and therefore unforgettable. John Lennon's transformation and the breaking of a bond. Ringo Starr always admired John Lennon. Even when the Beatles were fractured by egos, creative disagreements, and exhaustion, Ringo gravitated toward John's sharp wit, courage, and instinctive leadership. Standing behind Lennon on stage felt like standing behind a force of nature. But nothing prepared him for the transformation that began in late 1968, when John and Yoko Ono became inseparable, not just as partners, but as a single creative unit that slowly eclipsed the rest of the band. At first, Ringo didn't mind Yoko's presence. He respected her as an artist and assumed her involvement would be limited. But it wasn't long before she began inserting herself into decisions that had always belonged to the four Beatles alone. During one experimental recording session, Yoko abruptly offered her critique of Ringo's drumming. In the old days, John would have laughed it off, defended his bandmate, or turned the moment into a joke. But this time, he turned sharply toward Ringo and said coldly, "Just keep it even. That's enough." The room fell silent. For Ringo, the humiliation hit deeper than a technical correction. It was a signal that John no longer saw him as an equal partner in the band's identity. Yoko's voice now carried more weight than his. And that shift only intensified as John began withdrawing from the Beatles emotionally, spiritually, and creatively. Ringo confided to a friend that they used to be a band, but with John, it was now just him and Yoko. The breaking point came when John lashed out explosively at George Harrison for questioning Yoko's involvement. Ringo watched the scene unfold. A slammed table, raised voices, the unmistakable look of a man who would defend his partner at any cost, even if it meant burning the band to the ground. He had never seen John so consumed, so unrecognizable. The grief Ringo carried from this was not born from anger, it was born from loss. He had lost not just a collaborator, but a leader he trusted. Years later, when Ringo visited John in New York in 1980, the old warmth briefly resurfaced. And then, weeks later, John was gone forever. The wound never had a chance to heal. Silence became their final chapter. Paul McCartney, the teammate who became a studio dictator. Of all the conflicts Ringo Starr endured inside the Beatles, none cut as deeply, or as repeatedly, as the one with Paul McCartney. Paul was brilliant, tireless, and driven, but his perfectionism often came at a painful cost for those around him. After Brian Epstein died in 1967, the band lost its stabilizing force, and Paul stepped into the leadership vacuum. What was meant to save the Beatles instead became the spark that pushed them toward collapse, and Ringo was often the one who felt the sting most sharply. In the studio, Paul's standards grew stricter, his demands sharper. He wrote relentlessly, arranged obsessively, and micromanaged everything from harmonies to drum fills. For Ringo, who already carried the weight of being seen as the least talented, Paul's controlling nature intensified a quiet fear that he wasn't needed at all. The breaking point came during the recording of the White Album in 1968. Paul, frustrated with a simple drum pattern, made Ringo replay the part again and again, each time insisting on tiny corrections. Then, without hesitation, Paul sat at the drum kit himself, demonstrating how he believed the part should be played. For Ringo, it was a humiliating echo of the Love Me Do session 6 years earlier when Andy White had been brought in because he wasn't trusted yet. But this time, something inside him snapped. Ringo stood up, walked toward the door, and said bitterly, "You clearly don't need a drummer anymore." Then he disappeared from the studio for 2 full weeks. The remaining 3 Beatles were stunned. They sent him flowers. They apologized. They begged him to return. But Ringo's absence had exposed something they could no longer ignore. Paul's leadership had become a dictatorship. Even after Ringo returned, the crack never truly healed. Every time he sat down behind the drums, a small part of him remembered the moment Paul took his seat. The irony, decades later, is that Paul would become Ringo's closest surviving link to the Beatles, inducting him into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2015. Their friendship softened with time, but Ringo never forgot how it felt to be treated like a replaceable cog inside a machine he helped build. And yet even Paul wasn't the person Ringo resented the most, the outsiders who added fuel to Ringo's bitterness. While the wounds inside the Beatles were the deepest, the people outside the band left their own marks on Ringo Starr, some through arrogance, others through chaos, and some simply by embodying everything he disliked about the music world. These encounters did not create the same lifelong scars as those caused by John, Paul, or George, but they shaped the bitterness that accumulated quietly in Ringo's heart. Jim Morrison of The Doors was one such name. To the American public, Morrison was a mysterious poet, a dark rebel, a rock icon who lived on the edge. But to Ringo, he was a man performing his own destruction under the disguise of art. Morrison would appear on stage drunk, forget lyrics, scream incoherently, and collapse into chaos. Ringo, who fought his way through childhood illnesses and worked relentlessly to earn his place, despised what he saw as wasteful indulgence. "Morrison doesn't perform music," he once muttered privately. "He performs his downfall." And what bothered Ringo even more was how the public worshipped it. Then came Peter Sellers, whom Ringo worked with on The Magic Christian in 1969. Sellers was a legend in comedy, yet on set he carried himself like royalty. He demanded script changes, adjusted scenes to center himself, and treated co-stars like supporting furniture. When Ringo suggested a small improvement to make a scene feel more natural, Sellers shot him down with a cold line. "You stick to your drums, and I'll take care of the movies." It echoed every insult Ringo had heard in his life. The jokes about being the least talented Beatle, the headlines mocking his skills. Sellers became a symbol of every door that had ever been closed in his face. Mick Jagger represented another kind of irritation. Loud, flamboyant, and unrestrained, Jagger turned every performance into theatrical chaos. Ringo respected the Stones, but he didn't respect what he saw as unnecessary showmanship. "We write music," he once grumbled. "They dance." To Ringo, Jagger was the embodiment of the ego-driven rock persona he despised. And then there was Keith Moon of The Who, a friend, but an exhausting one. Ringo admired Moon's talent but dreaded his company. Moon's reckless behavior, from smashing hotel rooms to near-fatal stunts, dragged Ringo into chaos he never wanted. "When I went out with Keith," he admitted, "I never knew if I'd come home alive." Yet despite all these frustrations, none of these men were the person Ringo Starr truly hated more than anyone. That distinction belonged to someone else, someone inside the Beatles, someone he trusted, someone whose betrayal still haunted him decades later. The one man Ringo Starr truly hated more than anyone. For all the wounds caused by John's transformation, Paul's control, George's silence, and the outsiders who irritated him, there was only one man Ringo Starr admitted he could never fully forgive. Not because of ego, not because of artistic clashes, but because this man quietly orchestrated the destruction of the only family Ringo believed he ever belonged to. That man was Alan Klein. After Brian Epstein died in 1967, the Beatles drifted like a ship without a captain. Money was disappearing, Apple Corps was in chaos, and every decision turned into a fight. In that vulnerability, Alan Klein appeared, smooth-talking, aggressive, promising to fix everything. John fell for him first. George followed. Ringo, exhausted and desperate for stability, signed with them in 1969. He later admitted, "Klein was a hustler, and I felt it was time I had someone hustling for me." But beneath the charm, Klein was studying every fault line inside the band. He knew Paul's need for control, John's volatility, George's resentment, and Ringo's desire for peace. And he exploited each one. Suddenly, every meeting became a 3-against-1 battle, with Klein fueling the divide. When Paul refused to sign Klein's contract, Klein encouraged the other three to push forward without him. The result was catastrophic: lawsuits, accusations, and the final collapse of the Beatles in 1970. Only later did Ringo understand the truth. Klein had mismanaged money, manipulated contracts, and used the Beatles' internal tension as leverage. By 1973, he was fired and under investigation. Ringo, who had once trusted him, felt sick with regret. The man he believed could save the Beatles had destroyed them. Years later, Alan Steckler revealed a heartbreaking confession from George Harrison. "The only way the Beatles can ever get together again is if Alan isn't there." I'm ready. So is Ringo. It was too late. The damage was irreversible. For Ringo, Klein wasn't just a bad manager. He was the symbol of betrayal, the outsider who exploited their weakest moments, the man who shattered the greatest musical brotherhood of the century. And unlike the others, this wound never softened with time. Now that you know the full story, who do you think hurt Ringo the most? George, Paul, John, or Alan Klein? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more untold stories about music legends, make sure to like the video and subscribe for the next chapter.